Before I begin, I would like to say a word to Claus Offe, who is the person for whom we organized this meeting. Our relationship over 40 years is so interesting that I could devote an entire lecture to it, but all I want to say is that I've kept learning from you from the beginning of my time as a student in Frankfurt, and I'm tempted to, and I can't resist to relate this little anecdote that in my first year as a student, I attended the lectures and seminars of Professor Habermas, of course, and after this first year, I was desperate. So I didn't, it was, it was my feeling that this wasn't for me, and so that it was far beyond what I could ever do. And so I went to Klaus's Sprechstunde, and I told him, Klaus, this man has read 100 times as much as I have, and it is impossible to catch up with it. And so he said, you're not the only one to have this problem. I have a piece of advice for you. Specialize on something that he doesn't know anything about. So I ended up doing industrial relations. However, if you do something of political relevance seriously, and you pursue it to not necessarily the end, but to its ramifications, after a while, the specialization gives way to the need to connect to larger problems. And Claus and I think, subscribe to this in spite of the fact that there are the intimidating examples of how to make these connections. So far, on by way of introduction. Today, I want to say something with a few, and I show you also a few things like, okay, I think this is here. Yeah. I have slightly changed the title. Liberal Democracy, Hard Times for Democratic Theory. And this is what I want to address. I have prepared 11 points that I want to make, but 11 is a bad number, so it will be only 10. And the 11th point I will add in the discussion if needed. First of all, what is urgently needed is a renewal of critical democratic theory. The current crisis of the democratic capitalist state system should remind democratic theory that what used to be one of its central issues, the relationship between democracy and capitalism. What is needed is a rediscovery of authors such as Dahl, but also Hayek. Hayek, I think, is the man who is hovering over Europe today with his sort of depoliticized economic institutions. But also the work of Claus and Jürgen Habermas in the early 1970s. And it would be extremely interesting, and it is extremely interesting, I can say, to reread the work on crisis theory. My impression is that in subsequent decades, under the impression of the performance of the economy, we forgot how critical, how deeply fragile this order is. And we are now only now looking back, and we're seeing that there were ideas there that should not have been pushed as much into the background as we did. But I was one of those who thought that crisis theory was out, yeah, and that institutions were good enough to handle the problem. What I suggest is including in democratic theory what I call a parametric specification from abstract discussions of majority rule versus minority rights, autonomy versus collective will, how to secure, the real question now is more specific, how to secure a normatively legitimate social order in the face of free markets, an integrated global economy, unequal resource endowment, cumulative advantage, and increasing competition. And what I want to do is, I want to show how deep the problem is by discussing the issue of the debt crisis, the relationship between debt and democracy, what it means for democratic theory that the tax state, the Steuerstaat, as Schmitter and Goethe used to call it, roughly 100 years ago, that the tax state has given way to the Schuldenstaat, to the debt state. And that the debt state is being transformed into a consolidation state or austerity state, and what that means for, let's say, the next 20 years of democracy in our countries. And I'm talking not about democracy in general, because I want this parametric specification, and my subject is democracy in the democratic countries of the OECD world, not the transitional, where you have very, very different specific problems. Second point, democratic theory from the right, public choice. What we have seen in the last 20 years is that public choice theory has basically taken the place of democratic theory in the public discourse. Today, the relationship between capitalism and democracy is discussed mainly by the right. Economic theories, public choice theories of the common pool blame the public debt crisis on democracy, not being able to respect economic laws, democracy failure, and claim that for capitalism to work, democracy must be restrained. Public finances being a common pool, there's not enough discipline in a democracy to prevent organized citizens from taking more out than they put in. Essentially, that's the old story of the tragedy of the commons, reheated in different language as a model. And it's the old story of primitive accumulation being described to us as an act of efficiency, economic rationalization. Yeah. The solution is reduction by public spending, by Hayekian institutions that are insulated against political pressure, in analogy to an independent central bank. This is what we're now seeing in Europe. And this is, I think, what is inevitable in Europe. This is coming. Third point, the alternative, something that we as progressive intellectuals must push forward into the debate, into also the public discussion, is a historical theory of the relationship between capitalism and democracy that avoids Hayekian anti-democratic revisionism, explaining public debt by capitalism not being able or willing to live with democracy, capitalism failure rather than democracy failure, and argue that for democracy to work, capitalism must be restrained. So we turn the table around. Rather than an abstract model, the argument requires recourse to a historical context, in particular the context of the temporary reconciliation, temporary as we now know, reconciliation of capitalism and democracy under the so-called post-war settlement. Embedded liberalism is the concept that we usually use for this. After the war, a restoration of capitalism was deemed accessible across the political spectrum only if capitalism could be made compatible with elementary human interests by very strict conditions on its operation. In fact, also promises of its future performance. And here is a list. Exhibit 1. And you can go through this list and you will see from today's perspective, all of these are these utopian ideas about stable employment, extensive public services. But this was part of the package, not just in Germany and Europe, but also in the United States, in the New Deal United States in the 1950s and well into the 1960s. The country, the United States, was subject to capital controls in order to be able to manage the domestic economy. This is also not a list of items that people invent in their unending search for a good life. It is, or for an easy life. It is what made capitalism acceptable for these post-war societies. It was the condition for the hunting license for capitalists to be renewed. And of course, these are all sort of revisable, but basically, the fundamental assumption that underlies all this is that no society can exist on market justice alone. No society can exist as a market. There must be modifications of the market for people to be able and willing to live with this. And now is my fourth point. What we observed over a long period of 30, 40 years was a process of liberalization and the breakup of this post-war settlement. It begins with the end of post-war growth in the late 1960s and the failure of economic planning, mixed economy. When I studied sociology, the economy was a mixed economy, not a market economy. And England, France, remember the book by Andrew Schonfield on modern capitalism? All these countries were full of mechanisms, institutions that were to contain the market rather than to let it free. The breakup of the post-war settlement begins with the end of post-war growth in the 1960s and with the failure of economic planning, when capitalism turned out to be unable to deliver on the post-war democratic peace formula, die Friedensformel des Kapitalismus, so hieß das damals bei uns in Frankfurt. In the 1970s, a long-drawn process of liberalization began, which in effect amounted to a gradual withdrawal of capitalism from the commitments extracted from and entered by it at the end of the war, needs to restructure under alleged pressures of globalization, were and continue to be invoked to justify structural unemployment, individualization of the employment contract, renewal of managerial prerogative, privatization, precarious employment, recommodifying social policy, rapidly growing wage dispersion, and social inequality. We have to have this historical memory to know what is at stake in the game that is now being played. Fifth point, I call this in compensation 3 expensive messes of pottage. Now, for the Germans, the German word for a mess of pottage is ein Linsengericht. It's a biblical story about selling your birthright for nothing. Liberalization, you could also say the coming out of capitalism, or coming out again of capitalism, proceeded during this period. Economic growth was successively replaced in its role as pacifier of economic conflict and stabilizer of social peace by inflation in the 1970s, public debt in the 1980s, and deregulation of private debt in the 1990s, all sort of injections into the political system. Inflation, public debt, and private debt provided rough corrections of the distributional outcomes of expanding markets. You can call it, I call this dirty equity. Yeah? Rough corrections, rough justice, some justice. But of course, all 3 were no more than stopgaps that worked only for a short time until the economic dysfunctions began to prevail. Inflation was repaired by union breaking. Public indebtedness by public expenditure cuts. Private indebtedness by fiscal expansion. And renewed public indebtedness by global austerity. Now, this is the period where we're now. Historically, the arena where stagnant growth, together with rising inequality, is compensated, moved from the labor market, inflation, to electoral politics, debt, from there to private capital markets, deregulation of private debt, and today to financial diplomacy in international markets. I've shown how these successive arenas were increasingly better protected from the political participation and intervention of ordinary people. Sixth point, democracy in retreat. Rather than the various forms of rough justice allowed to cover up low growth and rising inequality, the dominant development since the 1970s was the erosion of the post-war settlement and the liberation of capitalism from democratic control. Unlike what was promised, liberalization has restored growth only for those at the upper end of society, while it has pulled the bottom out from under the labor market for ordinary people. And that is also a relatively general process. It includes even Sweden, with rising inequality and structural unemployment of 5, 6, 7% for a long, long time, with the government having given up on the political full employment commitment. The dissolution of the post-war settlement has done more damage to democracy than to capitalism. As capitalism has liberated itself, the reputation of and the participation, the reputation of politics, political parties, trade unions, and democratic elections has continuously declined over these 30 years of liberty, which is an interesting anti-Hayekian argument. It cannot have been democratic pressure because there was less and less democratic pressure, less voter participation, anything. So let's look at Exhibit 2. No, this was wrong here. This is where the Exhibit 2. This is my colleague Armin Schäfer, who looks at turnout in parliamentary elections. And there you see from the 1960s, 1970s, 1960s onwards, and this is sort of the whole OECD world, there is a steady decline in election participation. You could now add figures on union membership, party membership, it's all the same. Public survey data, reputation of unions, it's all the same. It sort of varies from country to country, but the trend is always the same. And here is Germany, 1970s, 1980s. And then Armin, in this work, which is to come out soon, looks at who is abstaining. And it is completely clear that the abstentions are concentrated at the lower end of the society. That what happens is that people in the last decile, in the last two deciles, sort of disappear from politics, which has a sort of reinforcing effect on the behavior of political parties, who know that in these areas where these people live, you will not be able to get many votes. Therefore, you don't go there. Therefore, you write your programs more and more for the middle class, like in the United States, where the interests of these people who don't vote, you don't have to cater to. In fact, you shouldn't, because that could scare away your voters. 7. The rise of public debt in parallel to the rise of neoliberalism as capitalism struggled free from its post-war constraints. So, rather than resulting from an increase in the power of democracy, the fiscal crisis of the state under advanced capitalism developed as economic inequality increased, wages stagnated, and welfare states were reformed. This is a parallel development. And I have 7 countries that stand for different, you can take averages, you can do what you want. It's always the same curve. Public debt all over in the capitalist world, in social democratic Sweden as well as in Republican United States, in liberal as well as coordinated market economies, in presidential as well as parliamentary democracies, doesn't matter. The latest critical jump in public debt after the party's successful consolidation efforts of the 1990s and early 2000s, which were compensated by increasing private debt, did not result from irresponsible democratic politics, but was caused by the financial crisis turning into a fiscal crisis. This is where the red line comes in. The increase in public debt after 2008 has nothing to do with democratic pressure. It had to do with the need to bail out the financial institutions. And we now have good data that the fiscal crisis is is bigger in countries where you have a large financial sector, and there's a strong correlation between the two. Ulrich looks a bit concerned. How far are we? Okay, good. Okay. The rise, point 8, it's only 3 more points. The rise of the debt state coincided with the decline of the tax state. Democratic theory must consider the possibility that the gap between public spending and public revenue may be due, rather than to some citizens taking too much out of the common pool, to some other citizens not putting enough in. And here I take an average of my 7 countries, and you see that the lower curve is government revenue in percent of GDP. And you see that while expenditure increases as it did in the 1960s, roughly about in the early 1980s, there is an end to the increase in taxation in these societies. So a gap opens up between spending and taxation. And my hypothesis, which I find plausible, is the following. Increasing demand on public finances under contemporary capitalism may indicate, rather than frivolous waste by democratically empowered citizens, a growing need under capitalist modernization for public investment in infrastructural support and public spending on social repairs through social policy, as the social fabric crumbles under the pressure of modernization. Interesting, Wagner's law becomes extremely interesting. He explains the need for rising expenditure by the modernization of society. Yeah? You also remember Karl Marx, incidentally, about this idea of the growing socialization of the process of production in a world of private property, where at some stage you get a fundamental contradiction between the need for collective investment, spending, and so on, and the private property in a bourgeois society. This was already a concern of people like Goldscheid and Schumpeter at the beginning of the 20th century. Schumpeter was convinced that the tax state could still survive this. Goldscheid was less sure, but now 100 years later we see that in this curve there could be a problem. And it could be there again. So stagnant public revenue may be related to growing tax resistance at the end of the post-war economic growth period and at the end of inflation. There's a good arguments why this should be the case. Moreover, liberal democracy with open borders has made it increasingly possible, especially for large firms and the owners of monetary assets, to avoid contributing to covering the social costs of their own prosperity. This is also interesting. Here we look at the rates of taxation in these 4 societies, and we're looking at 1989 beginning. And in all these cases, we see a sort of, if you draw a trend line, a conspicuous sort of tendency of taxation to fall. Yeah. If there was an Anspruchsinflation, inflation of demands involved in the rise of the debt state, I claim it was on the part of the well-to-do who managed to keep their growing wealth to themselves rather than share it with the public. The Schumpeterian tax state, I claim, or we observe, has outlived itself and gives way to a modern debt state. Point 9, question, democratic failure, question mark. Yes. First failure, not to have prevented the neoliberal reawakening of capitalism, which would have rendered its compensation by deficit spending unnecessary. I'm willing to argue this point. Secondly, not to have regulated the financial sector at the international level, so as to protect governments from the need to rescue it, and societies that were allowed to become dependent on it needed also to be rescued, like the United States, where 40% of all private sector profits in the middle of the last decade, came from the financial sector. Third, not to have taxed the beneficiaries of capitalist growth and prevented them from evading their responsibility to pay for it. In other words, not to have forced them to internalize such costs, making growth less attractive by forcing them to, which would be interesting if you think of limits of growth. Why not tax growth rather than subsidize it? And finally, not to have understood the distributional implications of debt financing of public responsibilities. Debt, and I owe this insight to Carl Christian von Weizsäcker, who likes the picture that I'm going to draw, but I dislike it, but otherwise we agree on the picture. That is taxes not collected. The owners of money, rather than having it confiscated by the state, can keep it, lend it to the state, safe investment, Vermögensbildung, private capital accumulation, get interest on it, and pass it on to their children. Right? Instead of taking the money from the rich to pay for growth and the infrastructure of democratic equality, states borrow it from them and pay interest on it to them, thereby reinforcing and extending social inequality and making themselves dependent on the market. Now, Weizsäcker calls this my Jacobinite beliefs about the world. I'm willing to accept this. Why should they keep it? 10th point and last point. The contemporary debt state, a struggle between two constituencies. The current crisis marks a new stage in the relationship between democracy and capitalism, requiring, as I said at the outset, a radical rethinking of democratic theory. The crisis of 2008 has increased public debt to a level where creditors lost confidence that states will be able to serve their debt, partly because these same creditors caused this financial crisis, right? and had to be rescued by states taking up too much debt. To ensure that their investment is not lost, creditors have taken a more active role in the governance of democratic states, much like the activist shareholders of the shareholder value age of publicly traded firms. So I would think that states have become very much like large companies exposed to the capital market. And here is my exhibit for a sort of categorical scheme within which this new situation one might want to discuss. The debt state has taken the place of the tax state. The debt state that has taken the place of the tax state has two constituencies, not just one. Its creditors and its citizens, competing with one another for attention and control. Philippe will recognize this. We once developed this notion about the logic of influence and the logic of membership in intermediary organizations. It's something like this. A complicated and as yet largely unexplored struggle over primacy between the the debt state's two constituencies. So I can't go into this. I will only ask you to look at the list of items. So the one is, one constituency national, the other is international, which gives it a great advantage. One is citizens, the other is investors. Investors have much less loyalty than citizens, and they are not sticky to the soil. Voters and creditors, rights of citizenship are sort of complemented by claims to assets. One is sort of grounded in public law, constitutional law. The other is grounded in civil law, contract law. The one constituency articulates its will through periodical elections every 4 years. The other through auctions. Auctions take place continuously. And what they think about a government, they express by raising or lowering the interest rate when you refinance your next tranche. Public opinion enters. The citizens have loyalty. The markets have this strange thing which is called confidence, which can go and away. and you can pretend that you don't have confidence anymore, even if you have. And public services sort of are complemented by debt service. Yeah? And the struggle that takes place here is, as I said, extremely complex. And I will conclude by giving you a few, a glimpse on this. Creditors want institutionalized austerity in these states to establish priority, Vorrang, vorrangige Bedienung for their claims over the claims of citizens. Some creditors, however, are also citizens. Those of us who buy government bonds, some of us do. Some creditors also who want and need government services and benefits in addition to low taxes and sound money. So they are torn between two perspectives. Creditors want growth to secure government's ability to service their debt, but they also want austerity, and nobody has yet invented how you can have austerity and growth at the same time, except if you believe in supply-side economics squared or to the cube. Creditors use variations in interest rates to exert pressure on governments. They are concerned over, that's a very interesting point, creditors are constrained and concerned by the possibility of sovereign debtors unilaterally to default on their debt, which is the last vestige of traditional sovereignty in this world that we have not yet really explored. They can simply apply a haircut. Yeah? But creditors, being internationally organized, can use international politics and international organizations to discipline national states and to prevent them from doing what they could do, namely simply declare themselves unwilling to repay, which is, after all, even a consumer today can declare bankruptcy. And then it's the fault of the firm that has sold him something. Yeah? There's also a Pfändungsgrenze in civil law, which doesn't seem to apply in relation to the poor Greeks, yeah, who have to pay for things that others have taken up from. Last point, use international politics, international organizations to discipline national states, and they can discipline them because there is a threat of an external effect of any state declaring bankruptcy might drive up the interest rates for all other firms. And if you look, I can't do this now, if you look at the structure of public budgets, you'll see that even a tiny increase in the cost of refinancing can really throw off a national budget. Yeah? So they must keep it low. And for this, they have to prevent states. And then Frau Merkel seems to be permanently calculating what is cheaper, right? Let the Greeks go bankrupt or help them not to go bankrupt. Okay, nobody understands this really, and make the market. The job is to neutralize and sterilize democracy at the national level in order to make the behavior of national states market conforming so that they can survive in this world of a double constituency and at the same time keep their people, their citizens at the national, keep them somehow patient, as you said this morning. Yeah? And I will finish here.